What if everything we've been taught about Eve is only half the story? The Bible tells us she was formed from Adam's rib, but this simple description hides a profound and haunting mystery. Unlike Adam, who was molded from the earth, Eve was created from a living being, a process that has mystics, scholars, and theologians questioning her true nature for centuries. Was she truly just one of us, or was she a being of a different order, a final act of creation that defies simple understanding? Her unique origin, immediate consciousness, and prophetic role in Scripture point to a truth far more complex than the traditional narrative allows. In this video, we'll peel back layers of tradition and theological interpretation to explore ancient texts, forgotten scrolls, and mystical traditions that suggest Eve was not merely the first woman, but a sacred paradox, part human, part divine. Was Eve really just a human or something more? The Bible tells us she was formed from Adam's rib, but it leaves much unsaid. She was not made from dust like Adam, nor born like any other woman. Her creation was intimate, mysterious, and singular. And for centuries, this has raised a haunting question among scholars, mystics, and theologians. Was Eve truly one of us? Or was she something beyond human comprehension? If we compare her origin to that of Adam, the contrast is striking. Adam was molded from the earth by the direct hand of God. But Eve was not formed from the ground. She was drawn out of a living being, Adam himself, while he slept under divine anesthesia. That detail alone sets her apart. No other person in the Bible is made this way. What kind of being emerges not from dust but from flesh, bone, and spirit combined? In some Jewish traditions, this act of creation is seen not as a downgrade from Adam, but as an upgrade. The Zohar, a mystical text of Judaism, suggests that Eve contained both masculine and feminine spiritual elements. She was not an afterthought, but the completion of creation, a being of balance. Some rabbis believed Eve initially held greater spiritual sensitivity than Adam, perceiving dimensions he could not. She saw the serpent first, not because she was weaker, but because she could see deeper. Then there are the Gnostic texts, controversial writings banned by the early church. In some of them, Eve is portrayed as a bearer of divine light, a revealer of truth, and even a spiritual counterpart to Christ. In one version of the Book of Baruch, she's called the mirror of divine reflection. Not just the first woman, but a being containing heavenly knowledge. These portrayals were suppressed, branded as heresy, but they never fully disappeared. There's something else that has puzzled theologians for centuries. Eve's immediate awareness. Unlike Adam, who took time to understand the world, Eve seems fully conscious from the moment she's introduced. She speaks reasons, questions, and engages the serpent in complex dialogue. No learning curve, no adjustment. She simply is. Could this suggest that her creation included a direct infusion of knowledge or spiritual consciousness? In early Christian writings, some church fathers speculated that Eve possessed something they called primordial memory, a kind of inner awareness of the divine order before the fall. This memory, they believed, is what allowed her to be deceived not out of ignorance, but because she sought something greater. Some even suggested that Eve didn't sin from rebellion, but from a misdirected longing to return to the knowledge she once glimpsed, a desire not to destroy, but to restore. Then we look at the serpent's approach. He doesn't go to Adam. He speaks to Eve. Why? Many assume it's because she was weaker, but what if it was because she was more spiritually attuned? The serpent knew who could perceive the hidden things. The text says, Eve saw that the fruit was desirable to make one wise. She perceived more than physical hunger. She saw into the nature of the act and chose, not blindly, but with full awareness of its weight. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it complex. Even the punishment she receives is different. While Adam is cursed with labor from the ground, Eve is given pain in childbirth and conflict in relationship. But nowhere does God call her evil or less. Instead, he speaks of future generations, of continuation of redemption through her seed. This isn't condemnation, it's prophecy. And through that line, something remarkable unfolds. A promise that one day through a woman the serpent's head would be crushed. Not through a man, through her. Let's not forget the language used in Genesis. When Eve is introduced to Adam, he says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." It's the first poetic statement in all of Scripture. Adam is a ruck, not merely pleased, but overwhelmed. The Hebrew language here carries an emotional charge suggesting that Eve was not just his partner but a reflection of something far greater than himself, something almost divine in symmetry, form, and purpose. Some early apocryphal texts take this further. The Apocalypse of Moses claims that after the fall, angels wept for Eve, not because she was the cause of sin, but because she carried a spiritual glory that had dimmed. One passage describes her as the one whose voice echoed like Eden, implying a pre-fall, radiance lost to time. And though her actions led to exile, her essence remained different. Not fully like us, not fully like Adam. A bridge between realms. Islamic tradition also offers a unique view. Though not named in the Quran, Eve, known as Hawa, is believed to have been created in paradise itself. Some commentators believe this made her essence unlike that of any other woman, created in perfection, surrounded by angels. She was not earthly in origin, but heavenly. And when she descended to earth after the fall, it was not just exile. It was transformation, a being of heaven now clothed in mortal form. In many ancient traditions, women were seen as life-bearers, vessels of mystery and divine intuition. But Eve was more than the first mother. She was the first design, the prototype, a being who held the imprint of both heaven and man. And after her none were made the same way again. Every woman came through birth. Eve came through breath, bone, and sacred command. That makes her origin not just rare but entirely unique. One forgotten scroll discovered near Nagamati contains a passage where Eve is referred to as the breath within the breath. Scholars have debated this phrasing, but some interpret it as symbolic of a dual nature. Flesh drawn from man, yet spirit shaped by God's inner breath. If true, it suggests that Eve was not a mere copy of Adam, but a being composed with a hidden spiritual layer, one that even Adam did not possess in the same way. There's also the question of why Eve is never given a specific age, lifespan, or detailed death in canonical scripture. Adam's death is recorded. Seth's is listed, but Eve's silence. Why is the mother of all living left without a documented end? Some ancient mystics believe this was intentional, that her death was not like others, that she returned rather than died, that her being was assumed into another realm, her mission complete. Though speculative, this theory grew in early circles that honored Eve not as a failure, but as a sacred threshold. Another powerful tradition claims that Eve did not die in pain or sorrow, but in vision. In her final moments, it is said she saw a glimpse of the Redeemer to come, the one promised in Genesis 3 verse 15. According to fragments from the book of Adam and Eve, she cried tears not of regret, but of hope. She knew the seed would come and her mistake would not define the story forever. In that final breath, she became the first to believe in redemption. And what if that belief, pure, unwavering, was itself the mark of something more than human? What if Eve, as the first woman, was given not just physical life but spiritual awareness unlike anyone who followed? What if she walked with God not only in the garden but even after? If that's true, then Eve was not just the first human woman. She was the first spiritual vessel designed not merely to live but to carry eternity within her. There's a curious line in Genesis that many overlook. After the fall, when God questions Adam and Eve, he speaks directly to the serpent first, then to Eve, then to Adam. Some scholars argue that this order reveals something unexpected, that Eve was central to the narrative, not peripheral. Her role was not merely reactive. It was foundational. She stands between the serpent and the man, receiving prophecy and judgment, not as a passive figure, but as a spiritual axis. And then there's the promise. Her seed shall crush your head. Not Adam's, hers. This wasn't just a statement about childbirth. It was a spiritual declaration. God placed the future of redemption inside her, not him. That alone sets her apart. It suggests that within Eve existed something untouched by sin, something that would remain, waiting across generations, a spark preserved for the moment of divine reversal. In later Jewish mysticism, this spark would be called the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God. While the term doesn't appear in Genesis, some Kabbalistic texts hint that Eve was the earthly vessel for this divine presence, that even after the fall, she continued to carry a remnant of sacred glory. Her suffering, her exile, and even her motherhood were not punishments, but processes of purification. She was walking not just through history, but through transformation. When early theologians debated the nature of Eve, they often focused on her failure. But others, especially mystics, saw something different. They saw her as a mystery too deep for surface reading, a creation unlike any other, formed from another being, shaped by God's hand, animated with breath from paradise. And that raises the question once again. Was Eve ever meant to be only human? Or was she the last piece of heaven still walking the earth? The more we search, the more we realize Eve's story is fragmented, scattered across scrolls, visions, and whispers. But the mystery remains. Why did the serpent target her first? Why is her creation so different? Why does her role extend far beyond motherhood into prophecy, exile, and the promise of redemption? These are not just narrative details. They point to a deeper truth, one that suggests Eve's identity was never meant to be ordinary. In some early Christian sects labeled heretical by the Roman Church, Eve was called the first temple. That term wasn't architectural. It was spiritual. They believed she was the first container of divine presence on earth. Just as the Ark of the Covenant later carried the Word, Eve carried the breath and design of God in her very being. To them, her failure didn't erase her sacred origin. It only proved that free will was real and that even the holiest vessels can break. There's also the curious pattern of restoration through women in Scripture. It is through women, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Miriam, Hannah, Ruth, Mary, that God repeatedly reestablishes his promises. Eve begins this line, but what if she wasn't just the first? What if she was the blueprint, a sacred archetype from which all other spiritual women would descend? Not genetically, but symbolically, not just the mother of humanity, but the spiritual prototype of redemption itself. And if we accept that possibility, it reshapes how we view her fall. Maybe it wasn't just a failure of obedience, but the ignition of a hidden plan, a descent that would one day give birth to the greatest descent, a paradox written into creation itself. One that began not in the dust but in the rib, the breath, and the mystery of the woman whose name means life. When we examine the Book of Wisdom, an ancient text not included in all biblical canons, there's a verse that speaks of the woman through whom salvation would come. While many associate this with Mary, early scholars believed it hinted first at Eve. She was both the origin of the problem and the origin of the solution. This paradox made her not just a character in the story of humanity but a gateway between divine intention and human history. Another striking clue lies in how Eve is named. Adam named all the animals. Yet it is only after the fall that Eve receives her name. Before that, she is simply the woman. Some rabbitic commentaries suggest that this delay in naming signifies her unique essence. She was not to be classified with creation but set apart from it. Her identity wasn't meant to be defined by Adam's words, but by God's breath. The name Eve, meaning life, wasn't a description. It was a prophecy. Even the serpent's conversation with Eve reveals something intriguing. He speaks to her of becoming like God, knowing good and evil. This phrase is often interpreted as deception. But why would this temptation work unless she had some spiritual sense that she was already more than just flesh and blood? What if Eve's fall came not from weakness, but from a misplaced pursuit of something she partially remembered, a divine image she already carried? Ancient Christian mystics once described Eve's creation as the second breath of Eden. They saw Adam as the form but Eve as the completion, the living echo of divine harmony. In their writings, she is compared to the song of creation itself, an embodiment of beauty and wisdom that transcends human limitations. If these ideas hold any truth, then calling Eve just human might be the greatest misunderstanding of all. In several Gnostic texts, Eve is presented not as the deceived but as the revealer. In the hypostasis of the archons, she is described as the one who awakens Adam, giving him spiritual sight. This flips the traditional narrative completely. Rather than the one who led man into darkness, she is portrayed as the one who tried to lead him into light. Her knowledge was not rebellion. It was remembrance, a search for the divine origin they both shared but had forgotten. Such betrayals, though banned and condemned, persisted in secret among early Christian sections. They didn't see Eve as a symbol of failure, but as a being of divine mystery, part spirit, part flesh. One Gnostic scroll even refers to her as the daughter of light in a body of clay. That single phrase encapsulates the entire debate. Was Eve merely human or a vessel designed for something the human mind still cannot grasp? And even in the canonical Bible, traces of this mystery remain. Paul in 1 Timothy 2 verses 13 to 14 mentions that Adam was formed first, then Eve, and that Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. This has often been used against women, but it also implies something deeper. If Eve was deceived while Adam sinned knowingly, who truly held more spiritual weight? Who bore the heavier burden? The one who reached for knowledge or the one who followed in silence? This may explain why Eve was chosen as the vessel for the messianic promise. Not Adam, not the man who stood beside her, but the woman who bore the consequence and yet continued. Through her, life would go on. Through her, the enemy would be crushed. Through her, redemption would begin. And if that's true, then Eve was not merely human. She was a divine paradox. Fragile yet chosen, fallen yet favored, punished yet prophetic. In many ways, Eve's very silence after the fall speaks louder than any recorded words. We don't hear from her again in the pages of Genesis, except for brief mentions as the mother of Seth and others. Yet that silence has been filled for centuries with questions, theories, and visions. It's as if her story was intentionally hidden, but because she represents the part of us that once touched the eternal and now lives with the ache of its absence. Her creation wasn't just about companionship for Adam. It was about balance, reflection, and completion. She was not the side character in his story. She was the final act of creation, the last breath before rest, the closing note of divine harmony before the fall broke the rhythm. In some ancient traditions, it's said that Eve still weeps in a hidden place, not as punishment, but as prayer. That her tears are not of guilt, but intercession for her children, for restoration, for Eden to be reopened. Symbolic or not, this idea reframes Eve as something much more than human, a being who, even in brokenness, continues to reach for the Creator, not out of fear, but out of memory. And maybe that's the real reason her story remains so powerful. Because in Eve, we see the full range of the human experience. Wonder, trust, failure, exile, and hope. But we also see something more. An origin that defies simplicity. A creation that hints at mystery. A soul that still echoes in every question we ask about who we are and who we were meant to be. One ancient commentary from the Ethiopian tradition refers to Eve as the veil between heaven and earth. The imagery is striking. She is not described as a wall but a veil, something that covers but also reveals, something that must be moved aside to see what lies beyond. This poetic view positions Eve as a threshold, not a barrier, a sacred space through which life, mystery, and revelation once flowed freely. And what if her creation wasn't just biological, but prophetic? God could have created both man and woman from the dust. But he didn't. He made Adam from the ground and Eve from Adam. That act wasn't accidental. It was intentional, symbolic, deeply spiritual. It speaks of connection, of reflection, of shared essence. It implies that Eve's origin was more relational than elemental, woven into the fabric of humanity.